Tonight we are going to talk about the rise and fall of the Ostrogoths, who, I don't know how familiar you are even with the name Ostrogoths. What are Ostrogoths? So we've had before that we're going to talk about Goths. We talked about these same Goths when we were talking about Gothic architecture, which I had a lecture a little bit of him. I like these Goths because they're cute. Anyway, so they're very scary, right? So the Goths are scary. So our Goths that we're talking about tonight have absolutely zero relationship with 20th and 21st century teenagers, with 12th century and beyond architecture that goes by this name Gothic, or even in fact the 12th century font and writing style that you might be familiar with, kind of Gothic text. Maybe even think of like that as being sort of how German used to be written in. Or Old English. Yeah, so we have that same font that I was able to pull, it was just kind of like called a Gothic font. In point of fact, none of those things, Gothic architecture, the Gothic writing, or Goths, have anything at all to do with actual Goths. And so the Gothic architecture is created, what we now call Gothic. It wasn't called Gothic until the modern era. And it has nothing to do with the tribe of the Goths, which was totally extinct centuries before that was created. Likewise, the writing style, and of course, the Goths today, which are inspired by the architecture, not by the barbarians. So, I thought you were commenting. Okay.
Just a reminder that if there are any questions in the house, quick
Yes.
questions, John will repeat the questions, and if it's a lengthier comment, urgent, we'll bring the microphone to you.
Absolutely. And
And
if people online have a question, you can type it in.
I will voice the questions for people watching on Facebook.
Beautiful.
So please do ask your questions, and do tell us your comments.
So this is one of a bazillion fun maps and charts that we have tonight. We don't have to memorize this entire thing. This is one of the types of Goth that we are talking about. One of the ways of Gothic that is a thing that we are talking about tonight is Gothic, the language group. And so the Gothic language, which is, as you might know if you know about the language families, that in the same way that French and Italian and Spanish and Portuguese and Romanian, those are all descendants from Latin, which is the language of the West Roman Empire, but that over time languages evolve and now they've diverged and they're their own different languages from each other. Likewise, the Old Germanic or Proto-Germanic language ultimately evolved into plenty of other different Germanic languages. And so if we start at the original Old Germanic, then that splits into kind of what linguists divide geographically to an eastern branch, a western branch, and a northern branch. The northern branch, Northern Germanic, is called Old Norse. And so that's that language that we have, like all the Viking sagas and everything like that are all in that. And that divides into different regions that become essentially East Old Norse becomes Danish and Swedish, and the West becomes Norwegian and Icelandic, and then some of these other languages, for example, like Greenlandic, that means it's extinct, right? So red here is extinct, and the green ones have lived on. Yellow means that this chart got stolen from Dutch people. And so they were just showing how important it is to get to Dutch, right? But anyway, it just means that these are extinct, and Dutch is the living language, of which Dutch has a child language, Afrikaans, down in South Africa, that is also a living language. Anyway, that's part of the big Western branch. The Western branch includes everything from, this thing that became Dutch, which is the Franconian branch, the Old High German branch that becomes Upper and Central German. It becomes essentially Standard German, is derived from that, as well as Austro-Bavarian and Swiss German. So anyway, the different kinds of German that are spoken together. And then there's this, also in that same Western group, is Anglo-Frisian, and that gives us Old English and Old Frisian. And so Frisian is this language of the northern part of the Netherlands that continues to be exist. It's English's closest relative, right, other than Scots English, right? So this is essentially the living language. So Yola was. It's a pidgin. I think it's between English and something else, maybe, and it's extinct. But I might be forgetting. I have to look it up what it is. Someone can look up Yola and tell us. Anyway, so this is the big complicated branch. But we notice maybe that there's a whole branch here. Northwest branches are still alive, but there's this other branch called the East Germanic languages, which are all extinct. And these include things like Burgundian, Vandal, and Gothic, including Crimean Gothic, which is a little bit different from the rest of Gothic because it only went extinct much more recently. So that's, those people, the Goths were still hanging out in Crimea of all places. Anyway, they're gone now, but that's that eastern branch. So that kind of gives you a sense. It's a language group, and it's one of the ones that is part of Germanic from 2,000 years ago, and of which now they're all extinct. So, now that's complicated. There's going to be a lot of these. Okay. So if this is kind of a map that is looking at the Roman Empire, you can kind of see the territory of the Roman Empire, and this kind of frontiers are shown here. As it is in collapse, when the Huns come in and put all this pressure on all of these German tribes, these tribes, like the Goths, who have been living here, they're part of that eastern branch, remember? They've been living here, and they're splitting into Eastern Goth and Western Goth, which is to say Ostrogoth and Visigoth. They are pressured and go into the territory of the empire, as do other confederations that we're maybe familiar with. The Franks, who cross into now giving their name France. The Alemanni, you might know that the French people and the Spaniards call Germans Alemanni, right? Because these are the Germans that stayed on the other side, of what's Germany as far as the Franks are concerned, and so they give their name to that. Places like the people like the Burgundians, they go to where it's now Burgundy, right? And the Lombards ultimately end up in Lombardy. And tribes like the Suevi make it down to here, and then we don't think about them. Those Vandals who were, where did they start? I don't see where the Vandals are coming from, but anyway, they're coming from up here somewhere. So the Vandals are the ones they're known for vandalizing Rome, which is why their name has become the word for vandalizing. They end up in Tunisia, of all places. Anyway, so these guys are all on the run, and of course, very famously in English history, the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes make their way into England to create what Angles make Angleland, Saxons make Wessex and Essex and all those places, right? So those are kind of how it's working. Yes, question. Can we get? Where did the Huns come from is the question. So you can kind of see Huns here, right? So they came from essentially Mongolia. And so they are part of this long tradition that goes all the way up until the Mongols. The Mongols are kind of the last hurrah of this, and they do very successfully. In the later Middle Ages, the Mongols create a large confederation that conquers China and conquers the Middle East and goes very far towards actually putting a lot of pressure on Europe even too. And so that's like the biggest one of these, let's say, steppe nomad confederations where people who are natural herders and who also are doing everything on horseback. They have a particular kind of warfare which settled peoples, so people who are living in what we call civilization, where because we usually think of this from we don't have the nomad perspective. Someday we'll do a lecture and we'll give the nomad's perspective. So anyway, from our perspective, they're barbarians, and we are in civilization, and so which is to say we live in cities and do agriculture and things like that, and we also tend to have a bunch of infantry. And one of the things that's a mess for settled peoples is that the nomads, when they come in with their light cavalry, they charge at you real fast on horseback, and they have these really arrows, and they just shoot everybody and kill everybody. And as the troops are trying to get up to them, they turn around and go away. And they just do that relentlessly until you are dead. And so it's very hard. It's been very hard for like 2,500 years to do anything about it. And so the Huns are one of these confederations. They are speaking a Turkic language, and they anyway, so they come from that Central Asia, and they make their way through to what's now Ukraine, and then ultimately their empire, they conquer all those Germans. And so at a certain point under Attila the Hun, their empire includes all of this northern and eastern part of Europe. And underneath them are the Germans and the Slavs.
Hungarians?
So the Hungarians are unrelated to the Huns. So the reality is that the Huns were pretty scary, and everybody remembered the Huns. And they remembered the Huns are those guys on the horses that come from the steppes. The Hungarians are actually related to people from Finland. So they're ultimately a people that are from Finland. They speak a language that is related. Hungarian is actually, a language is Magyar, and the people are called Magyars. We call them Hungarians. But anyway, the Magyars are related to Finnish, and they were just like every other Finn that's up there at a certain point. But they live next to these steppe nomads, and so they adopt their culture. And so they start to do those same things with the herding and the horses and the archers and things like that. And so then long time after the Huns are destroyed, the Hungarians, the Magyars, come in the Central Middle Ages, and they live in that place, this place right here. The Romans call it Pannonia, what we call it Hungary. And they set up their kingdom there. And it's just where the Huns had been, it's where the Avars had been, it's where all these steppe guys come and live, because it's this little piece of steppe that exists in the middle of Europe that you can use to raid everybody else. And so that's why we call them Hungarians. Not related at all to the Huns, although the Hungarians look back on it as kind of like a little bit of a pride, and they think of the Huns maybe as, they've got like the sword of Attila and stuff like that, they think, and I don't know. Anyways, so. Okay, so by the 4th century then, by the time the Huns are getting there, the Goths are in two major confederations, which we call the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, and that's from their own word for east and west. So Ostro, you can kind of hear east in that, and Visa, you can kind of hear west in that, since Gothic is, English is a Germanic language just like Gothic, although it's not closely related. And so with that arrival then, the Visigoths, who have been in a lot of contact with the Romans. So we think of these Germanic tribes as being, the Romans called them barbarians and things like that. They are living on the opposite side of the Roman border and have been trading with the Romans and kind of getting Roman goods and services and things like that for, let's say, 300 years. And so they have already imbibed a lot of the kind of culture and civilization that's on the Roman side of the border. And meanwhile, by this time, the Roman Empire has also undergone lots of plagues, and there's reasons why it's become radically depopulated. So its population has gone down substantially from when it's at its peak. And so the barbarians, as the Huns get there, and nobody wants to live with the Huns, so the Huns are very scary. They ask the emperors, can we please come across the border and be federates? Can we be allies in the Romans and help defend the Roman Empire against these Huns? And so they get permission to do that. They cross the Danube, which is the frontier between Germany and, or the Magna Germania, this area where all the German tribes are, and the empire, and they settle in Thrace, which is modern Bulgaria. The Bulgars are another one of these people that come from the steppes originally, although now they're Slavs. Anyway, we can't go into that. So, after fighting wars against the East Romans, so while they're in there, it isn't a particularly immediately happy thing. So there's a bunch of, semi-Romanized barbarians that are now living in the empire. The empire doesn't want to give them food or money and things like that, and so they end up having to take matters into their own hands at a certain point. And so there are Gothic wars. At a certain point then, the Eastern emperors, who are in Constantinople, which is quite close to Bulgaria, encourage the Goths, the Visigoths, hey, wouldn't it be nice there's so many more better places for you to raid in the western part of the empire. Why don't you go to Italy? And so they take that hint and they go west. We have here kind of an interesting 3rd century Roman depiction of what they felt Goths at the time looked like as they're having a big battle here against the Romans. You can kind of see a legion here. There's a Gothic guy here, so doesn't have a shirt, but he's got pants. And so that's one of the big differentiators between Romans who don't wear pants and these German barbarians who do. That's where we get pants. So, okay. So the Visigoths. So on their way west, the Visigoths quite famously sack Rome in 410. But every once in a while, they also start allying with the Romans, and so they will occasionally get bought off by the Western Emperor and things like that, but also occasionally ally with them. And so, for example, they form an alliance with the Romans as federates and inflict actually a major defeat on the Huns in France in 451 AD. But in the meantime, the Visigoths, anyway, from their time in Italy, they've made their way first to Aquitaine, where they create, which is southwestern France, they create a kingdom of their own there. And then over time, they conquer from other barbarian tribes Spain. And because Spain is bigger than Aquitaine, they kind of start moving down here. And so Toledo becomes their capital. And so that becomes the capital of the Visigothic kingdom. And the Visigothic kings then rule Spain from the year, their kingdom anyway, from 416 and down in Spain down to 711 when they are conquered by a Muslim expeditionary party led by Tariq, so the guy for whom Gibraltar is named. And so that is the end of the Visigoths who go extinct then in 711. Meanwhile, their cousins, the Ostrogoths, were slower in entering the empire, but they ultimately do. So they are hanging out in that area, that Pannonia that I keep talking about, where eventually they're getting displaced by the Huns and things, and so they want to get out of there. So they are following, and when they cross into the empire, they conquer the area that is Rome itself and Italy, and they create a kingdom for themselves that is in Italy, the surrounding provinces of the Adriatic here. And so then the Ostrogoths continue to rule Italy until a successful invasion by the Eastern Roman Emperor, the Emperor Justinian the Great. He retakes Italy for the empire, after which the Ostrogoths then also become extinct. So this is why this entire language family that included Vandal and Ostrogothic and Burgundian, this East Germanic language group is all extinct because all of these guys got wiped out eventually. Okay, so tonight's story is entitled Rise and Fall of the Ostrogoths, but it's also a lot about the fall of Rome, as you can imagine, since this is all happening in the wake of the fall of the Western Empire. This is that same sarcophagus that included, we saw the Goth over here, right, with the pants. And you can see all these Romans that are fighting Goths and everything like that as a I think it's emblematic of the time because it's a very chaotic time period for the Roman Empire as they are struggling against all of this incursion of all of these peoples across their frontier. So I'm a Star Trek fan, I'd mentioned a couple times. There is kind of a moment in the old Star Trek show, in Star Trek The Next Generation, there's this moment when the Earth and their federation of planets is about to fall, potentially, to this very scary aliens called the Borg. And while he's doing it, the kind of Shakespearean actor Captain Picard muses, I wonder if the Emperor Honorius, watching the Visigoths coming over the seventh hill, could truly realize that the Roman Empire was about to fall. This is really just another page of history, isn't it? Will this be the end of our civilization? So he's remembering this story of Rome, and I just quote that not because Star Trek matters in this case, but because in the popular imagination, the way we think of especially this era is in this framework of rise and fall, and especially decline and fall of the Roman Empire. According to the way we usually kind of tell this story, I've probably, as a thumbnail, used 476 a million times in all of these lectures as kind of a traditional or working or historian's date for when the Western Roman Empire falls. What happened in 476? In that year, the 16-year-old emperor, a guy named Romulus Augustus, who is usually referred to as Romulus Augustulus, which means little emperor, as opposed to, anyway, so it's a diminutive and also a smear, is deposed by the general of his armies. So his own technically subordinate, the person who is the Magister Militum, the head of the armed forces of the West, Odoacer, who is himself a Germanic warrior. I think he's half Vandal maybe. So by this date, however, so even though we kind of call this the fall of Rome, by this date, the city of Rome had already been sacked by the Visigoths in 410 and by the Vandals in 455. It's not like it was depopulated entirely or anything like that. It was, still ongoing, but it had been already fallen a little bit. Although the city of Rome, this was the Western Roman Empire in 395, although it continued to have symbolic importance, and Rome was by far and away the most populous city in the West, and indeed it still relied on massive imports of grain from Sicily especially, but also North Africa, in order to feed as many people as were there. It had been a very long time since the capital of the Western Empire had been moved. So in 286, it was moved first to Milan, and then afterwards, Milan actually, even though it's a good place to defend against all of these alpine passes through which all the barbarians keep coming, it's way less defensible than Ravenna. And so in 404, it was moved to Ravenna, which is where that last nominal emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is ruling in 475, 476. Okay, so what's Ravenna? So this is Ravenna. Ravenna is like a 5th and 6th century Venice. And so we wouldn't even know it to go there now because the river has entirely silted in. And so all of this, the river moved, so the mouth of the river Po doesn't even make it down here anymore. And meanwhile, then all of this became a marsh and it's all silted in. There's one little canal channel and things like that that's kind of left, I think, and it's otherwise mostly all just surrounded now by land. And so you have essentially what was essentially a little Venice in antiquity, but if you then filled in all the land around Venice like it is right now, and it just had a city around it now, which is what Ravenna has. And so Ravenna has its own little kind of living city that's even kind of like an industrial city and that kind of a thing. So it's kind of interesting because it has this ancient core that was on islands, but it's now surrounded. It had two different little parts. So there's the main city, and there's the port. And so there's a reason, therefore, you can imagine why this is very defensible. This is a natural moat, in the same way Venice is, and it has walls and things like that. And also, very advantageously, you have all of the support of the empire that you can get via water. Right? And so they can bring the navy up to there, and they can supply from the western provinces, and you also have a very direct route to get to the Eastern Empire, to get to Constantinople. So
Is
that's
that a model somebody made?
It's a painting, I think. It's an artist's rendition. It would be super cool if somebody makes a 3D model of this. That's because it's really neat. Because I'd like to be able to zoom in and see what everything exactly is, but that's the image. Okay. So you may not have heard, even a lot of people I've talked to when I said I was going to Ravenna, they hadn't even heard of Ravenna. They're like, what are you going where? But you might have seen this picture before. So this is a fairly famous mosaic. And so if you ever are seeing, for example, Byzantine or East Roman Empire mosaics, the earliest ones, a huge proportion of them, including this one of Justinian, that Eastern Roman emperor who reconquers Italy in the west, along with his generals who also helped him, generals over here on this side who helped him do it, and his troops, and his bishops over here on the other side. We're conquering it for Orthodox Christendom. Justinian's picture is here, as is his wife, Theodora, her eunuchs and her ladies. Other mosaics that show actually a contemporary picture. So this is actually what the city of Ravenna looked like, emphasizing, though, the palace. So from the picture of the palace, you can see the city behind here with all of its kind of wall and that sort of thing. as well classis, its ports. You can see over here it says classis. And so this is that port that Ravenna has, which again is walled, and you can see it's got access to the sea and the navy. This is a picture I've used before, which because I think it's pretty interesting. And I talk about how in so many ways that Christianity is very Roman, you know, and especially then when it becomes a religion of the Roman Empire in the West in the 4th century. We don't often picture Moses as looking like this. I think of him as looking like Charlton Heston, I guess. But anyway, he's certainly not usually wearing, let's say, have haircut like a Roman and wearing a toga and stuff like that, you know. But you can see here, this is Moses, right? And it's because at a certain point when Christianity becomes the religion of the Roman Empire, everybody saw themselves and they see all the Bible characters as being like them. And so Moses and all of the other prophets are always dressed like late Roman philosophers, and so they wear the clothing of late Roman philosophers. Likewise, who's this? Jesus, right? So we don't usually do Jesus without a beard nowadays, but he's wearing here the purple robes of a late Roman emperor, again, kind of a purple-y toga thing. You can tell it's Jesus because he's got the cross behind him, right? And he's got a Byzantine crown here, or a late Roman a West Roman crown, and Byzantine probably. Anyway, and then he's got angels and generals and nobles, right? Bishops. So this is, anyway, how then the empire and Christianity has already been very much Romanized, and a synthesis of all kinds of Greco-Roman culture that it's totally intermixed with. So, oh yes?
And all of these conquerors, Huns and so forth, have gradually taken
like this.
on speaking a more Latinized form of language.
Right. So the question is, I'm going to do that. So the question is, if all of these countries, we saw how the Roman Empire in the West falls, and so we have the Visigoths and the Franks and the Ostrogoths and the Huns, and they all speak different languages. So the Huns have a Turkic language, and all of those other people have Germanic languages, Visigothic, Frank. So we think of French people, we don't think of them as speaking a Germanic language, right? We think of them as speaking French, which is a descendant, albeit a little, weirded up one, but anyway, compared to Italian, but it's a descendant of Latin, right? But it's because what happens is, as these relatively unpopulous tribes, so there's only a couple hundred thousand in any one of these confederations. When those people move into that territory that has, let's say, a couple million Romans in Gaul, over time, you could assimilate it the other way if there was a strong cultural reason for doing it, but the Germanic tribes do not do that. And so in every case, they lose their language and they speak the language of the people that they've conquered. And so that's why French is descended from Latin, Italian is descended from Latin, Spanish is descended from Latin. The same thing happens for Turkic peoples like the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bulgars, who all speak Slavic languages. They don't speak Turkic languages anymore. And so they assimilate those things. And so that happens often when for example, it doesn't always is the case, but this is a rule of thumb. So if a people who are culturally less sophisticated take over a more sophisticated, or people who are poorer take over a richer society, they often the existing society's language and customs and law have a much better chance of surviving, and that's what's happened here. It doesn't always happen, especially if they're much more numerous. Although it's completely possible for it to go the other way. So an example is Turkey. So in the case of Turkey, all of those people in Turkey, when the Turks got there, just a couple 100,000 people again, in an area that had millions of inhabitants, they all spoke Greek, but they all assimilated into learning Turkish, and so it can go the other way. And that happened, for example, in England, where Latin is largely lost, and so more or less lost. And the local people learned either revert to their Celtic language if they were already kind of mostly speaking that, so they become speaking Welsh and Gaelic, or they assimilate and they start speaking Angle and Saxon, and that becomes English. So it can happen either way. So anyway, in this particular case, so Hun is gone, Visigothic is gone, Ostrogothic is gone, all those things. Frankish is gone. But one thing that has survived, is just, and one of the things we kind of realize is just this remarkable survival of all of these buildings from the end of the Roman Empire, these vast churches and other government buildings, mausoleum and things like that, and in what amazing state. So just filled with all of these in frescoes even, but especially mosaics and certainly their floors and everything like that. They've all survived remarkably intact. And so it is a little bit of a different narrative than we sometimes think when we think of the Roman Empire as just being completely wiped out and gone. There's actually lots of stuff from the later part of the empire that has survived, especially in a place like Ravenna. And we'll talk about why it has. So I want to talk about, though, this framework that we have of survive and fall. When we come to understand things through the lens of history, we think of maybe history as being about just a bunch of facts and things like that, and it's maybe more scientific than, or we'd like to think of it as more scientific than maybe it is. But there is a lot about history where the word story is definitely important and related to it. And that is because history involves not just those kind of facts, but also narrative, as historians construct narratives to explain what's important. And so there's inherent bias in deciding what's important, listening to, what sources, what are we thinking about? And then when we say that, what happened and why, then that involves also biases in terms of survival of evidence and that kind of a thing. But one of the things that we might not be aware of in terms of historiography is we have a truism that history is written by the victors, but is actually written by the first person who ever wrote it down. And so, generally speaking, if a historian writes the narrative or creates that original story, that story is really hard to wipe out and replace with a different story. And so generally speaking, even if you have, people talk about and often decry and dislike what they call revisionist history, every single time you write history, that's revision. So there's no, all history is continual revision. But if a historian, for example, even completely overturns the conclusions of a historical narrative, they often are still completely dependent on the narrative itself. An example in my particular, one of my fields of expertise in church history, in the history of the Restoration, the history of Mormonism, there's this kind of beginning biography of Joseph Smith, where this, which was written by Fawn Brodie in the middle of the 20th century, and it was just decried by everybody who was a believing Mormon because she just destroyed, she was an attack and a blasphemer and all these kind of things. They really hated everything that she said. But if you go through her story and her narrative, it almost is exactly using exactly the same sources as the official histories of the churches that had been written as the first narrative. It just has a different conclusion and a different interpretation. So it's almost using the exact same narrative. Likewise here, in terms of this framework we have of decline and fall of the Roman Empire, there is in fact a reason why that's our vantage, and that is because we have a very venerable historian who is at the beginning of this framework for us, Edward Gibbon, whose history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire is also itself among the most important books in the history of history. As a result of it being so important, what Gibbon wrote has really affected all of how we view this history ever after. And so, for example, as a result of that, one of the things that we know about late antiquity is the Roman Empire declined and fell. And that's one of the frames that we then view everything through. In great part then, though, even though he has had that and we've inherited it, this narrative would actually surprise people a lot in the Middle Ages. They would not have ever thought of Rome as actually declining and falling. Certainly, if we go to the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which continues on, it survives with very significant continuity. The state continues to exist until the 15th century. And we can say anyway that Gibbon kind of agrees, because he actually does follow the history of the East Roman Empire until the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. We call that whole time period, we call it Byzantine history, but the people themselves did not use that term. They called themselves Romans the whole way. So from the perspective of the East, this was the new Rome. Hey, we're still the Roman Empire, so there was no fall as far as they were concerned. But even in the West, there was actually very little sense that the empire was gone. So in that time period after Romulus Augustulus, initially what happens, and this is a picture of one of the Germanic masters of the military, who continues to rule Italy after, and you can see he's dressed in a very, he's still maintaining this kind of Roman background that he does, even though he's got, his beard and his modern barbarian sensibilities. He is still, even though he's a king of the Germanic tribe, he still is making the claim for centuries that they are nominally subject to the Roman Empire of the East. And so they go through all the different ways in the forms where they use, in Latin, they use the title patricius. They are patricians of the empire. They understand that the sovereignty is coming from Constantinople, and that actually has effects. And so they don't conceive themselves as having had a fall in the empire. And there simply ceases to be a Western emperor. In the meantime, at a certain point, the Eastern emperors we saw when Justinian made the Ostrogoths go extinct, so here's Justinian, the Eastern emperors returned to ruling parts of Italy until 1071. So again, active involvement of the Roman state continues until the 12th century in Italy, for example. And meanwhile, by the time of the 12th century, it had already been many, many centuries that there had been a revived emperors of the West when the popes started crowning the kings of the Franks, Charlemagne and his successors, and then later his successors, the kings of what we call Germany, as emperors. We say Holy Roman Emperors, but they didn't use that phrase at all. They just called themselves Roman Emperors. So they saw that as full continuity until the abolishment of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, which is to say after Gibbon. So in point of fact, most of the people, even in the East or the West, are not seeing it the way Gibbon saw it. It doesn't mean that there was no decline or fall of the Roman Empire. It's just that idea hadn't taken hold until Gibbon. So to answer that question that Picard asked, which is, I wonder if the Emperor Honorius, watching the Visigoths coming over the Seventh Hill, could truly realize that the empire was about to fall. The answer is no. Absolutely not. He did not envision that. Nobody had that framework. So here's Honorius, the Emperor Honorius, who reigned in the West from 395 to 423. He does not know what you mean by the empire is about to fall. That's his gold solidus, his coin. Okay, this is the coin from Charlemagne. He looks kind of Roman, in this coin. They are still, this is a denarius. So this is a Roman unit of coinage here. And you can see that it's written in Latin, Carolus imp ug, which is to say Imperator Augustus. So Roman Empire is still going on as far as everybody is concerned. Again, what do you mean fall? These guys are not seeing it that way, right? So let's look at what did happen, though, because we do know that for us, when we do things, for example, when we look at everything map-wise, they didn't have maps like this. As of 395, which is the last time period when the whole empire is unified under a single emperor, Theodosius I, who's ruling both the eastern and western halves, whose capital at the time are Constantinople and Milan. But you can see the Huns are right here, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. If you just go to 526, it's a very different looking map, right? So we have the Eastern Roman Empire making in continuity, but now we have again those, what we think of as the barbarian kingdoms. So the Ostrogoths centered on Ravenna, the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks up here in what's going to be France, the Vandals hanging out in Tunisia, and the Anglo-Saxons and just back here in Pannonia being scary, waiting their time, the Lombards, right? And so when we look at the difference between these two maps, the one is all Roman Empire, and it's all like it's always been, as of as late as 395. But the Roman Empire has already suffered, as Valerie says, this series of vast number of plagues. It's had a big economic slump. It's had all kinds of internal civil wars. It has also suffered from just rampant income inequality, especially in the West, the senatorial elite have vast estates that just have tens of thousands of slaves that are working it, instead of back when the Roman Empire was very strong and it was growing at the time of Caesar, when there are in fact lots of small farmers who own their own plots of land and who then can go and become a legionnaire and go and fight the wars as kind of a part of a kind of citizen soldier of the Roman Republic. This has ceased to be possible by the time we get here to Theodosius, because there are no more of these kind of citizen farmer legion guys. Instead, we are having to recruit, the Roman government, central government is having increasingly to rely on Germanic federates to bring across and recruit into their armies, because the population area on this side of the border has vastly decreased. At the same time, there's been a population growth over here in the Germanic tribes that are enhanced by all the trade and everything like that they've had with the civilization, and so therefore they come across, and that's why at this point even Theodosius is working with Germanic mercenaries more or less as his military, as he's holding off people like Germanic tribes and the Huns. So anyway, in that sense, there is less, much of the change has already happened, and our map doesn't show it. And so that's why this to this is so, crazy different. And yet, what also doesn't show here is how much of the state apparatus has absolutely survived and is still functioning here in the Ostrogothic kingdom especially, but to an extent also the Frankish kingdom, especially down here, and the Visigoths. So there is actually a lot of state survival in all of these, as we'll begin to see. And so even though the map has shown now just this 100% change, in point of fact, there's less change underneath this than we'd imagine, whereas before there was more change than what we'd seen. Okay, so this is going to be done very quick, this part, but just as a little bit of context, why are there two Roman emperors, right? So we're talking about the fall of the empire in the West, and I've been talking about the empire of the East. So at a certain point in these crises of the 3rd century, it just became, the size of the Roman Empire seemed to be too much to be even governable. And so one of the first strong emperors in a century, Diocletian, rejiggled the entire array of the empire and divided it into essentially 4 pieces, but specifically 2 halves with the East and West, and within them a senior emperor, an Augustus, in both of these, which are these 2, and the junior emperor who's called a Caesar or Kaiser. And so that is the split, becomes East and West, and that ends up, I can't go through all these either, but essentially we end up going from Diocletian himself, who chooses Maximian as his partner emperor. That goes fairly quickly into the succession into bringing in Constantius and his son Constantine, who is again one of the emperors in the West, but Constantine succeeds in conquering it all, and so bringing it all back together. But once it's been divided once, there are divisions between West and East, and so we can see here, like when it has both, he's the 5th Eastern Emperor and the 6th Western Emperor, and the first one of these with a cross here that's Christian. But you can see that a lot of them after him are not East and West; they're just East or West. Anyway, so then that continues as when there's essentially more crises and sometimes weaker emperors, they'll split it. If they've got sons, they'll maybe split the empire into 2 pieces, or that kind of thing will happen. It becomes permanent after Theodosius. So Theodosius is the last emperor. That's that map I showed you before of what the empire looked like unified. when he dies, his young sons become Eastern and Western emperor. So Honorius, the Western emperor, Arcadius, the Eastern emperor, and so then that division then becomes permanent between the two courts, the one in Constantinople, the other one initially in Milan, but quickly moving to Ravenna for defense. So when we get rid of Romulus Augustulus, what's the obvious change if the state mostly is functioning the same way? It's that there's no more emperor in the West. And so after Theodosius, then that last emperor who is emperor of the whole thing dies. Like I said, his empire is split between his sons. Honorius, already at this point then, his son in the West, is militarily dependent on his chief general, who is a guy of Germanic descent, so a Romanized Germanic warrior named Stilicho. Stilicho is essentially running the show, but while Stilicho is away in Constantinople visiting, conferring with the Eastern emperor, people whispered in Honorius's ear and said that he's going to betray you and this kind of thing. And so Honorius decides to have him arrested and assassinated. And in so doing, there's a major rebellion among the entire Germanic military, of which then Honorius has to kill a whole bunch of their leaders. And then all of the followers in the army defect to the Goths. And so this is one of the reasons for then the collapse in the Western Empire. So as I mentioned, we're having less capacity in Rome to make and grow your own homegrown legions. And so instead, they've been recruiting German federates. And so we get these titles in Latin like comes, which means companion to the emperor, and dux, which is Latin for leader. And those ultimately evolve into things like count and duke in English. Okay. So after Honorius, things go down actually pretty rapidly. One of the things that's unstable about monarchy often is if, for example, if you have a succession of child leaders in the dynasty, then you're reliant on whoever the advisor is. And it can fairly quickly happen that the monarch and the monarchy loses power to some other office. And in the Western Empire, that office is the head of the military. So with the continual threat of these invasions, so Germanic tribes, confederations keep crossing the border and raid, and the Huns are ever present. They also cross the borders and raid. The Western Empire is completely unable to reconcile the fact that the essential military function of the emperors has now passed to these Germanic generals, who themselves, though, because they're German barbarians, are disqualified from being emperors, excuse me, and so therefore being on top of the civil bureaucracy. And so unfortunately, this can't be reconciled. So the real power is in the hands of the military because it's a continual military crisis. But the civilian government that has all the legitimacy is essentially can't be in the same power. And so they're always constantly conspiring against each other and trying to, the two forces are essentially trying to off each other and often do. So there's a succession then of Roman civilian figureheads that are occupying the throne themselves, while people like Ricimer here, this is a modern statue, held the actual power, for example, under two of the later emperors in the late 400s. So as the emperors in the West become exceedingly short-reigned, so these are the last emperors, number 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27. So you can see here, Maximus, he's only emperor in the course of 455, right? Avitus between 455 and 456. So it's mostly just a couple years, right? And so when that's happening, as you can imagine, the office itself is radically losing its capacity or its power or its control over anything. So the real power starts to be in the rank of the Magister Militum, which is to say the chief general of the army, and those are people like Stilicho, Aetius, Ricimer. So in 476, a German named Odoacer becomes Magister Militum, and he turns on the civilian government. So he goes with the army, he captures the city of Ravenna, and he captures Romulus Augustulus, who he gets to agree to abdicate and is dethroned. The guy is actually very luckily not killed. This is a very rare, generally speaking, you do, but he gets sent off to Campania where he can live in a villa for the rest of his life with a nice pension. So sometimes that happens. But anyway, in any event, what's happened now is that the main thing that's happened is this figurehead of the emperors, all these last guys who really aren't accomplishing anything, is gotten rid of, and the place where the real power is, the Magister Militum, is ruling outright. So again, although modern maps here are going to show a very dramatic change, so now this is no longer the Roman Empire, it's now called the Kingdom of Odoacer. The primary change here is simply reuniting then that position of the head of the military with the head of the government. So he's not like all the Romans are suddenly killed or something has happened. Odoacer doesn't even lead a Germanic confederation. He is simply the head of the Roman military, which is largely made up of Germanic mercenaries, and he rules with the support then of the local Roman aristocracy, the senators, and he also recognizes the suzerainty of the Eastern Emperor. So essentially what they've done legally is they said, okay, we're just abolishing the existence of the Western Emperorship, and so now all of the territories that were subject to the Western Empire, they're now under essentially the Eastern sovereignty as far as everyone's concerned. So we all look to Constantinople now as the place of the emperor. Nevertheless, in fact, it's functionally independent. So Odoacer doesn't have to send them taxes or anything like that because the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire haven't been sharing taxes for centuries here. So he continues then to nominally, the empire is more or less, no one's getting posters up that's saying this is the kingdom of Odoacer now. It's still the Roman Empire. He's now a patrician, is what he rules, but he also has the title among his own men, Rex, so king of Italy. Okay, so Odoacer is nominally ruling for the Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, but one of the weaknesses of the division of the empire is that the two courts never get along and often intrigue with each other. And so they quarreled. There was a bunch of even fighting on the frontiers. And ultimately, at a certain point, Zeno, wanting to get rid of Odoacer, talked to another one of these federates, Theodoric, who's the king of the Ostrogoths, who is up there on the frontier in Pannonia, and he says, hey, I'm going to make you king of Italy now. And so the Eastern Emperor, in whose name Odoacer is ruling, has now decided, to use his legitimizing power and giving that crown to somebody else who doesn't actually own Italy or anything like that. But that was all the encouragement that Theodoric and the Ostrogoths needed to leave Pannonia, to leave Hungary, and decide to go into Italy, which is much richer. So the Ostrogoths invade. They actually got some support from their cousins, the Visigoths, who were hanging out in Spain. And by 490, they had really captured most of Italy from Odoacer, who was still hanging out in Ravenna. Theodoric invites him to kind of a banquet of reconciliation. You should never go to these. So guess what happens, So that's the end of Odoacer. So as he gets killed at the banquet. So who are these Ostrogoths? Who is Theodoric, who's now in charge of Italy, who's now king of Italy? So Theodoric, he's called the Great. In some ways, then, he's the last ruler of a unified Italy until the modern era. Although he is the last significant or last good, effective ruler. Although he's a barbarian as far as the Romans are concerned, Theodoric had actually had a lot of exposure to Roman culture. So we have seen that the Goths have been hanging out on the side of the frontier for centuries, right? So they are very aware of Roman culture. Theodoric himself is a nobleman, so he's from a dynasty that has been the ruling house of the Ostrogoths. And in the year 454, as a kid, age 8, he's sent as a hostage to Constantinople. This is just a standard procedure when you have allies. that you don't trust in antiquity, which you never trusted these guys. But anyway, these barbarians. And so what you do is they'd have to send their sons and things like that, the sons of the kings and things, so that those guys could come and be hostages in Constantinople. And if the the Ostrogoths did anything bad, then they'd get executed, right? Anyway, while he's there, though, growing up, he's quite classically educated, and so he's able to learn Greek and Latin and read and write, and also doing arithmetic. So anyway, he's not your average barbarian, although he also is trained as a Germanic warrior, which he continues to be. He becomes king of the Visigoths while they're still up there in Pannonia in Hungary. And like I say, Zeno recognizes them as this category of Federate, which means ally, who's kind of like a mercenary of the Roman government. So legitimized as kind of, now you're the Roman army, now you're our Germanic barbarians now, and you must do the kind of things that we want you to do, although they didn't always do that. All right, so from that point then, as I said, he invaded Italy and ultimately conquered Ravenna, and so now Ravenna becomes the capital of the Ostrogoths. So it had been the seat of those last straggling West Roman emperors. It had been then the kingdom of Odoacer, so that Germanic leader of the Roman military who gets rid of the emperors and just rules himself. He's ruling from Ravenna. Now it becomes Theodoric's capital. And when I showed you this before, this picture of Ravenna and this Palladium here, so this palace. So this, in fact, is in a chapel that is part of the palace complex, this mosaic. And this was it's the palace that is built by Theodoric and the Ostrogoths, including this chapel, including these Roman mosaics. So there's an ongoing use in Roman forms of architecture, Roman artisans, and indeed there's very vast building projects for the first time, which is why Ravenna has all of these wonders as the Ostrogoths get the state back going. And so you can kind of see here, this looks pretty Roman, right? So there's all these columns and arches and tile roof and everything like that. What you also notice from this is there's a colonnade, and each one of these has a curtain in front of it, right? But let's see if I can see it here. But it's not, I need to zoom in. But like if you can see right here, over top of the column, there's something on top of the column here. In fact, in several of these columns, there's something, and that's hands. And so what's happened here is, after the Byzantines, after the East Romans take Ravenna over and extinguish the Ostrogoths, they take out all of the images that had been here, which was probably Theodoric and all of his leading Ostrogothic warriors and officials, and they just cover them over and they put curtains. But they didn't do it properly, so you can still see the hands. See? Anyway, so that would have been, a portrait then of Ostrogoths. So Ravenna. So anyway, I've just brought this map back so that we can be reminded. Essentially, the Ostrogoths then are controlling this component of it, and they are in very direct contact with the Eastern Empire still. Okay, there is a lot of continuity before and after the fall, so-called, of the Roman Empire. So for example, Roman law continues. So Theodoric asserts and guarantees to all of his subjects who are Romans that they will continue to be subject to Roman law. And indeed, because he is even not an emperor, he actually can't create new laws. And so he's only able to make edicts, which allow you to essentially clarify existing Roman laws. All of the Ostrogoths continue to be ruled according to Ostrogothic custom and Ostrogothic law, but that is now held side by side with Roman law. Likewise, the land ownership. So there had been a thing under the earlier German mercenaries that essentially a third of the land in Italy needs to be given over to the Germanic military in order to have the support of the army, and that continues. But by and large, you can imagine it's poor landowners and middle class who suffer the most on those kind of things. And so the really rich senators continue to be super rich in this kingdom. And so land ownership has its ongoing continuity that doesn't get wiped out or anything like that under this barbarian kingdom. And so there's still the same senatorial aristocracy that there's always been. The only difference is that in contrast to all of those late and ineffective Roman emperors who could not get those senators to pay their taxes, Theodoric is able to get them to pay their taxes, and that's why he's able to build all of these things, and so it makes the state more effective.
Where can we get some more?
Where can we get one of those guys who makes billionaires pay taxes?
Yeah.
Yeah, we need to find some barbarians to invade, right? We might get it. We'll see. Anyway, so we might have a fall in our own way. It's different from the way the Romans. Latin continues to be the language of the government and of scholarship and everything in the West. Art and architecture, as we see, customs like public bathing continue. Even the religion continues. So already for a century, the state religion of the Roman Empire, Theodosius makes Christianity the state religion and persecutes paganism. And so all the Romans have become Christians except for Jews. There's a couple of pagans and things like that, but very few relatively. They've been quite persecuted. The Jews have faced some persecution recently, but actually under Theodoric, he writes very clearly that he renews to the Jews of Italy their ancient customs. So he gives them an edict of toleration because he says it's not for him to make laws that can dictate what people believe. So in fact, because he's well, not everybody agrees with that later, but for certainly under the barbarians here, that continues to be the policy. The barbarians are Christian, but they are heterodox, which we'll explain. So in other words, to say they're not mainline Christians. They're not the same. They're in schism from their Roman subjects. Even though, as we've seen, the use of the Germanic military, that's total continuity because before and after the fall of the Roman Empire, they're already using that. So what are they? What is their kind of Christianity? So the idea of it is that we've talked about how complicated the Trinity is many times. And so the Orthodox and Catholic position of the Roman Empire, and I say both because they're not in schism yet, the Orthodox/Catholic position is Trinitarian, which is, as we always say, quite complicated to explain, but it means that there is only one God, so the Christians are a monotheist, but nevertheless that God exists in three persons. And so, for example, those persons are the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. But the Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, and the Spirit is not the Father, right? It makes so much sense, right? So anyway, nobody had any problems with this. Well, it turns out that lots of people had problems with this. And one of the people that had problems with it is the Visigoths, who are not Trinitarians. And in fact, they don't see, for example, they do not see Jesus as being the same par of God as the Father. So God is really God as far as the Arians are concerned, as far as the Visigoths and all the other Germans who have this different non-Trinitarian kind of Christianity are concerned. So God is God, and Jesus becomes kind of divine, but isn't the same as the one God, you know? And so, and the moment that happens is actually at the moment of the baptism of Jesus. And so we'll explain how that works. This is, in fact, another building in Ravenna made by the Ostrogoths, and it's called the Arian Baptistry, which is because they're Arians and they made this building to get baptized in. It's one of the sacraments of Christianity. And so at the middle of it here, we've seen this picture probably before because it's pretty famous, but it's a baptism of Jesus. And you can see it's a very androgynous Jesus, naked androgynous Jesus with long hair and no beard, not broad-shouldered or anything like that. He's being baptized by John the Baptist here. and the Holy Spirit is kind of doing something, coming, descending in the form of a dove. Who's this?
God.
Zeus? God? It's the River Jordan, of all things. You can just see like how this pagan forms have really taken over, right? And so essentially, in pagan art, rivers are always portrayed as like embodied gods. So River Tiber or any one of these rivers, and so that's the Jordan. Why we don't? I don't anyway. Why should that be? But anyway, that's what it is. And so one of the ways then that we'll see why this is an important thing to depict for them. So there's, like I say, a kind of a zoom in of the kind of androgynous Jesus here, no beard. So for the Arians, they rely on an earlier and probably the earliest and more correct reading from the canonical Gospel of Luke. There's a moment where the evangelist Luke is describing the baptism scene, and after Jesus is baptized, a voice came from heaven, "You are my son, the beloved, I have begotten you today." And so this is very different from the way it's read now. The text that we have, the new version that we have is, "This is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased," I think is how it goes. And so this is the idea of it, the Arian reading of this is that it's only at this moment that this perfected human guy, Jesus, becomes the begotten Son of God. And so this is when he's kind of become divine, at this moment when heaven opens and God and declares it. So the idea of it, though, is, and it's very important theologically, is that if Christ is not co-eternal with the Father, that means if anything that is co-eternal with God in Christian metaphysics is God. And so if anything that is not co-eternal, and so that there's a moment in time where in time Christ existed and before that there was no Christ, then that means Christ is a creation. And so there's a big theological difference there. And this is the complaint I've had occasionally with when I'm asking about in Islam about Quran being co-eternal with God, because that means in Christian theology that Quran is another person of a divinity, it's a duality, not a trinity. So essentially there would be the creator and Quran. Shaheen has a point, though, to make maybe regarding that.
There's also a lot of disagreement between different Muslim groups as to the createdness of the Quran.
Oh, yeah.
The more orthodox position is that it is an eternal book that exists with God that was sent down.
Yes.
But there are other groups, notably the Mutazilites, who said, no, it appeared in time. It is therefore created in time and is not eternal.
Okay. So you can imagine why theologically this is something that people would argue about both in Islam and Christianity. Yes.
Yeah, I've sometimes wondered why there were such vociferous and bitter disputes over, what is the nature and substance of the Christ. And I'm wondering, did it also unpack into the way the law and the edicts were seen? Because if something is not eternal, if it's created in time, then it's not, let's say, maybe as potent a truth as something that is eternal.
Right. Yeah, it's not forever, right? So
yeah.
Anything that, generally speaking, if we go back to our Platonism, which is
yeah,
what
exactly.
this is all based on, right?
Yeah.
So anything that's eternal in the forms, those are, those are forever, and everything else is the perishable. Right.
Yeah. So I was wondering, then what's
so
the
it's a big
status?
Deal for
what's the status of the various truths and dicta and sayings and beliefs if they're not eternal.
Right, exactly. Well, especially then even for Christians, the second person of the Trinity, right? Because so for the people that come up with the Nicene Creed, which becomes the mainline Christian position, then all the persons of God are co-eternal, and all of, for example, Plato's forms become eternal because those forms are simply the ideas in God's mind, right? And so those things are all the imperishable, those are the eternal things, goodness, love, all those things. But the things that are creations are all perishable. And so this is a thing that especially the Greeks, but even the Latins could get a hold of this in terms of some of the idea of it. We're very theologically informed and we're very argumentative about. The Germanic guys, I'm not sure that every one of these Ostrogoths is really, figuring out the difference on a Platonism level here of this. But what they were aware of is that it pissed off their subjects, that they had their own special Gothic way of understanding this, and they were able to use that in order to not be subordinated religiously to the different bishops in the empire, right? And so they were Christians, and they were in charge of Italy, but they didn't have to listen to the Pope, who was also hanging around in Italy, because he is in schism from them, right? So they're Arians. They know how Christianity is really supposed to work. He's an Orthodox Catholic. He's wrong. So.
I'm just wondering how they managed to square the idea that Jesus becomes the begotten at the moment of baptism with the account of his birth.
Right, yeah.
Or didn't they?
And so, exactly. So the question, so even though this reading exists in Luke and is probably the correct reading, that doesn't mean that Luke is an Arian, So which is to say that doesn't mean that Luke has this idea, because Luke has a lot of other things that in that account, of the essentially the angels talking to Mary, and this kind of very divine birth kind of scene that occurs in that same gospel. So it's not like there was an earlier reading of the Gospel of Luke that totally works for the Arians. Nevertheless, neither one of these conceptions, Arianism nor Nicene Trinitarianism, neither of those conceptions existed in the first century. And so the gospel writers are not Nicene theologians, and they are not Arian theologians, and they say a bunch of stuff that you can use to argue for either position, which is one of the reasons why Christians did argue about it for 5 or 6 centuries, and now they do it again now in the modern times. That people are not all Nicene Christians. So Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, have a more Arian position again than mainline Christians. Okay. And in terms of the begotten thing, begotten doesn't mean, it's a weird word, but begotten doesn't mean born. No. So anyway, it's a special technical term in the philosophy here. Okay, so we've looked at all this. I want to look at a couple people on the ground. So we talked about the senatorial aristocracy. We had last year a whole lecture on the consolation of philosophy, which is one of the most important books in Western literature. So this guy, Boethius, is from this exact time period. So he's the author of that. He's an influential Western philosopher, Christian philosopher, whose goal is to translate actually all of Aristotle into Latin. And if he had been able to live and accomplish that, all of Western history would be wildly different. He was only able to get a couple things done, including, though, a bunch of Aristotle's work on logic. And so that was like the whole framework for logic in the West until Westerners in the Central Middle Ages got a hold of the translations that came through Arabic. So who is this guy, Boethius? He's a senator. Anicius, Manlius, Severinus, Boethius. You can tell it's getting more and more decadent time period, right? You get more and more names. So he's a member of the Roman Senate. He's from an extremely wealthy patrician family. He himself has served as one of the 2 consuls. If you remember back about how the Roman Republic works, the chief magistrates are elected for 1 year at a time, are both called consul, and they can check each other's power, and that's why how the Roman Republic works. But it's also the way that Romans knew what year it was. So they would say in the year that Pompey and Caesar were consul together. And so they would always date everything that way. That continued. So that tradition goes on, and they pick a consul, one representing symbolically the West Empire, one representing the East. And so in the year 510, Boethius was the consul, one of the consuls, and so that's a huge honor. So ever after, anytime anybody in the Roman Empire said what year it was when they're talking about 510, they didn't use the 510. Nobody called that yet. That's invented later. They said in the year Boethius, and whoever his fellow consul was consul. And he himself says that the greatest honor that he ever achieved is when his two sons were simultaneously consuls in the year 522. And you can imagine for that to happen, it's a time period when the Ostrogoths are getting along pretty good with the Byzantines, if they are able to pick both of the consuls for that year as being Westerners. So Boethius held all of the offices of this, what's called the cursus honorum, which is to say the ancient Republican nobleman's set of civic offices that leading up to consul. And he enjoyed, like I say, the revenue from those vast estates. He himself mingled with the senatorial elite. He lived by Roman law. And yet the guy's born in 477, in other words, 1 year after the date of the traditional fall. So in many ways, what he's doing in his life kind of shows, well, there's not a lot of fall around him as far as he can tell. There's been a lot of things that have happened in centuries, but in many ways, there's a lot of continuity that is ongoing after the fall. So if you're on the ground and we're asking ourselves, the map changed very radically. But from Western Empire to Barbarian Kingdom. But if you were really living in Ravenna in 470 under the Western Emperor, and then in 495 under the King of the Ostrogoths, what's really different, right? So one of the things then that happened then under the Ostrogoths to kind of bring the story all up and sum it together is that Theodoric was able to do that thing that none of those last Roman emperors were able to do, which is thread this needle. He was largely able to rule with the support of the Roman senatorial aristocracy, and he especially could get their support when the popes were also fighting with the Eastern Empire. So between the years 484 and 519, there was another one of these Christological controversies. So the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the Vandals and everybody, they're all Arians. And the Pope is a Nicene Christian, but of the Chalcedonian variety. And so then there's this moment when the Eastern emperors decide that they're gonna figure this thing out and get back together with the Monophysites who are in Egypt and Syria. And so they create this thing where it's between duophysitism and monophysitism called miaphysitism, which nobody liked at all. So the Greeks didn't like it, the Syrians, the Egyptians, the Romans didn't like it, but the emperors continued to have that be their policy in the East for all those years. Anyway, when that's happening, then the popes hated the Constantinople patriarch more than they hated the Arians who were in charge of them, and so that worked pretty well for Theodoric when that's happening. It's just a bunch of the complexities. However, the Easterners caved. Everybody went back to standard Nicene Christianity, and then when that happened, part of the problem was when you are constantly doing this thing where you are nominally ruling for a sovereign that is kind of your rival. So even though the emperor in the East, you kind of acknowledge him, you make coins in his name, you say his name as in honor, as the leader of the empire, even though you have total control locally. Nevertheless, that's always a source then for disruption. So, and monarchies are inherently unstable, especially at a moments when there's a dynastic, when there's a succession. So when Theodoric is going to get to die, he has to have a system in place where he can hold up against that potentially delegitimizing force. And so one of the things that is always able to happen is all those senators who consider themselves Romans, and that whole court that they're related to in Constantinople, who they consider to be their superiors, and they also like to intrigue. They can get conspiracies a lot. And so, for example, Boethius, as we know, the reason why he wasn't able to do that thing where he translated all of Aristotle into Latin is that he, from the position of being prime minister of Italy under Theodoric, he is accused of having a conspiracy with other senators to eliminate the Ostrogoths and to invite the Byzantines back in to rule the Western Empire directly. And so the whole idea, the whole reason why then he's sitting in jail and has lost everything and has lost his wealth, his power, his reputation, and everything like that, and he has to be consoled by philosophy and write this whole text of the Consolation of Philosophy, is because he was part of probably was guilty. We don't know. Anyway, he was either guilty of, or it was a credible accusation that led to him ultimately being executed for intriguing with Constantinople. And so that was always a threat then to Theodoric's legitimacy, but he himself, because of his tight reins over the military, was able to hold that in check while he's alive. However, you can see here's a mausoleum of him, so he doesn't live forever. No king can live forever. And so Theodoric in his lifetime was still a warrior king, right? So he had that education as a child in Constantinople, but after his death, his heirs all suffered from that same fate that the final Western emperors. So in other words, they're all raised and educated as Western philosophers. They're all educated by the church. They are all, Christians and sophisticates. They're not Germanic warriors. They're increasingly, even though they're the princes and ultimately the kings of the Ostrogoths, they don't particularly like going around and living like Germanic warriors. And the Germanic warriors that are still trying to maintain their customs and lifestyle in Italy, they're increasingly alienated from them themselves. And so they have that same detachment between the civil government of the kings and the actual military. And so beginning in 535, there's a new and strong dynasty in the east, the dynasty of Justinian the Great, who took advantage of the weakness in the Ostrogothic kingdom and sent a huge bunch of troops over and began a vast invasion of Italy. And that's why, for example, we see Justinian's portrait in Ravenna, because ultimately, after decades of fighting, the East Romans are able to conquer Ravenna and extinguish the Ostrogoths, although in so doing they cause much more devastation in the Gothic Wars of retaking Italy than Italy had faced when the Goths took it over to begin with. And so now Italy is not rejoined in the empire as a full component like it always had been, the center of the Roman Empire. It now essentially becomes kind of a poor frontier colony of the Eastern Empire, ruled again still from Ravenna, which for the next several centuries is the outpost or the capital of the Byzantine province of Italy. And so, in so doing, where is this? So this mosaic, like so many of the others that we've seen, is in this church that is built by Theodoric, but it is finished by the Byzantines, including by Justinian with all the mosaics and things like that, which is why he's in there. This is made 10 years before Hagia Sophia, and it actually, you kind of look at it, it looks kind of like a Byzantine church or even later Turkish mosques and things like that. And this is because this form is something that the Romans couldn't actually make engineering-wise centuries before in the age of Augustus or anything like that. So science, technology, engineering is ongoing, and this is made 10 years or is completed 10 years before Hagia Sophia. And so parts of the structure are a model for that great church of Christendom built by Justinian in the eastern capital. We also remember that baptistry. So when the Orthodox take over Ravenna, they have to make their own baptistry too. You can see it on the right here, that little octagon thing. And that has survived from the 5th century. So we had the Arian baptistry with a kind of a more androgynous Jesus, as we saw before. So over here in the Orthodox baptistry, it's remarkably similar. So given that they're really trying to say something very different, you still have Jesus. He's got a beard now. It's a little off center. So John the Baptist is more in the middle of it for some reason, but the Holy Spirit is still kind of, it's not maybe spitting on him, this holy power or begotten power or something like that, but it's still descending. And look who's here. The river Tiber still. Or not Tiber, river Jordan still. The Jordan River. So the god of the Jordan River is still there too. Anyway, so for whatever reason, even though they have a very different theology, the forms are still quite similar. But they had to make their own baptistry because they didn't want to use the Arian one. So, all right. So after Boethius's fall, just to wrap up here, the person who took it over as Magister Officiorum, which is to say the prime minister of the, not the military leader. So we have the master of the military, and this is the master of offices, right? And so Boethius had been master of offices. Now Cassiodorus becomes that. Cassiodorus is the guy who essentially formulates the 7 liberal arts and creates the entire medieval and later educational system for the West, the trivium, the quadrivium. He, however, is too associated as far as the Byzantines are concerned with the Gothic faction of the Roman Senate. So he is forced to retire and not be part of this new kind of Byzantine provincial Italy. And so he goes goes back to his villa, which he terms, let's see what we can find here, which he turns into a monastery. And so he actually creates the first monastery which is in charge of copying books and collecting books. And indeed, he's the person that founds that as a thing for monks to do. And so as time goes on in the West, as there's continual collapse, what happens is people follow that Cassiodorian model as the Roman nobles retreat into their kind of monastic sanctuaries and bring classical literature with them.
Did he really live a century?
No, I'm sure not. I don't know. He lived a long time according to this, but yeah, if I got those dates, that's what it says, right? Where'd it go? Where is it? Oh, this one.
That one.
Well, it says so. It seems unlikely. Maybe I've got the dates wrong. Anyway, we don't know. We'll look it up. So Justinian, ultimately from Constantinople, is able to conquer Italy. He also wipes out the Vandals. He doesn't beat the Visigoths, but he's able to kind of subdue them and take over Cartagena anyway, in this kind of area down here. And so sort of revives the empire as it sort of seems anyway in 565. But in doing it, he really sapped all of the energy out of the Eastern Empire and created colonies that mostly cost money and aren't actually doing much. So you've got to send troops. They're not actually helping too much in terms of the defense of the empire. And so a century later, with the rise of Islam and the eruption out of Arabia, the destruction of the Persian Empire there, the Byzantines aren't in much of a position to hold Syria and Egypt, who in any event are in schism from the Orthodox position of Nicene Christianity in the center. Meanwhile, the Slavs have come in and taken over much of the Balkans, and the Lombards have taken almost all of Italy, except for, again, this kind of narrow section. So with that little exception of time when Justinian owns all of Italy, Italy then is never unified again until the modern age, because the Lombards aren't able to successfully conquer the whole thing. There's always these little Roman outcroppings and things like that survive until it gets even more chaotic later. It doesn't take too long even though the Romans are kind of hanging on to this stuff, it doesn't take too long for the Arabs again to take all this out, including the Visigoths. So, we'll wrap it up. So, the decline of the Eastern Empire, the loss of most of Italy to the Lombards, led ultimately then to the Roman popes to turn their allegiance from Constantinople to a much more effective ally. So they looked north to the Franks. And we kind of do have a map here. So you can see after Justinian knocks out Ostrogoths and makes the Visigoths, humbles the Visigoths, the Franks are the big victors here, right? So they suddenly become much more powerful, and they become the main force that's left in the West. And so the Pope's ally with the leaders of the Franks, Charlemagne, who is that great leader of all the Franks, marches to Italy at the Pope's request and destroys the Lombard kingdom. And then in 800, in response, Pope Leo crowns Charlemagne as Roman emperor, reviving the Roman Empire in the West centuries after the last deposition of Romulus Augustulus. When Charlemagne is looking to revive a Roman Empire, indeed he doesn't necessarily think that it's ever fallen. He's not looking at ruins and fallen and what we kind of think of as this ancient pagan empire. Rather, he is considering essentially the continuity of Rome as it had existed. And so he goes to Ravenna, the last capital, and takes a look at what Ravenna looks like. And he takes a look at San Vitale here. Again, this completed by Justinian, started by Theodoric, this model for Byzantine churches. And Charlemagne then, when he goes and builds the first major new structure north of the Alps, creates his own chapel, which you can see is based very much on San Vitale and Ravenna, including the interior, which is meant to look just like it. So, what's the legacy? So what I'm kind of trying to show in this, although we have that framework of decline and fall, and we certainly, because of Gibbon, see the late antiquity as a story of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. In many, 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 many ways, the legacy of Rome lived on in all sorts of continuity. The Roman Empire emperors ceased to exist, although there were revivals, and so there's no direct continuity there. But other things there are plenty of other things for which there is total continuity, including cities like Ravenna. The reason why there's those 8 UNESCO World Heritage Sites that are largely undespoiled and are amazingly preserved is Ravenna just kept chugging along. And that was true for something like 70% of the cities in Italy of any significance have Roman cities that have just continued. A bunch of them, like Venice, are new creations of the Middle Ages. But it's surprising how much continuity there is. And that's also true in Provence and some other places in Spain and France. And so although Rome lives on, and indeed the later barbarians who come in after the Visigoths were wiped by the Byzantines, the Lombards have left all kinds of legacy, including the whole name Lombardy. Nevertheless, the Goths have disappeared, almost without a trace. The only thing that is more or less left of the Goths are what might have been. So if the Ostrogothic kingdom had been able to survive, hadn't been invaded by the East Romans, all of history would have been different. Italy might not have had this vast time period of being completely disunified. It might have been able to maintain itself as a strong kingdom through the Middle Ages. Who knows? So what might have been? The only other thing that survived that seems quite Gothic is this mausoleum, which is a very interesting, weird thing. So whereas, as we saw, those chapels, the different palaces, the different basilicas that are the rest of the remnants of Ravenna, even that Arian baptistry, which is almost the same as the Orthodox baptistry, those are all built very Roman. But this mausoleum is very weird. And so, unlike the others, this is built, it's not built of brick like they mostly all are. It's built of these giant stones of Istrian stone. And so it's all put together. It is a nonagon. So normally, things like San Vitale, they're octagons. It's easier to make an octagon, and there's all kinds of things that make octagons good. This is a 9-sided thing, and we had to go around it twice counting to make sure that we're like, this is a nonagon. This is very weird. And then, of all the weird things, this is on the top is one piece of stone that weighs something like I don't know, whatever, 300 tons. And so it's like carved as one piece of stone as a dome on top. Yeah, how did they get it up there? So they would have had to have had a ramp, I guess, where they would, or maybe they had a big. Do you think they had Romans? Romans had cranes. Wow, I don't know. It's really heavy. So I don't know exactly how they made it. But anyway, it's a very neat and weird thing, the mausoleum of Theodoric the Great, the last effective ruler of a unified Italy. I guess still Mussolini. I don't know. So Mussolini, was he effective? Anyway, so possibly the last one period. So anyway, this is very interesting. So the rise and fall of the Ostrogoths.
I have one question that came a while ago from Alex Beckman. And actually, this is a good time to address this question because we were talking about this aesthetic changes in the architecture.
Yes.
That there's this slide of you in front of this Roman temple or a Greek temple in Sicily. And,
yes.
And we go from that to San Vitale.
Yes.
Now, could you maybe talk a little bit more about like the art, like this depictions, all these things that we see in this mosaics, especially in during the time of the Ostrogoths, and like this new art that is emerging in this era? So we have this tendency when we think of Roman things, and the reason why I think that half the time when people go to Rome, they say they're quite disappointed by Rome, right? They go there and they say, boy, Rome wasn't what I wanted it to be at all. So they have all these expectations that I think are largely probably based of watching movies like Cleopatra or Ben-Hur or Quo Vadis or something like that, which is to say they want to see those Greek-style temples, and they want to see like a lot of marble and Greek and everything like that in that kind of a triangle with columns. But those are already very archaic buildings by the time that Rome is really even taking off, by the time the empire happens. And so whereas although they still are building those and they still have a bunch of those that are dating from the time of Augustus, the new form that has been created by the Romans for their kind of public buildings is called the basilica. And so they already exist as public buildings at the time of Caesar and Augustus, and so that early part of the empire. So we don't think of those, we think of basilicas as being like a Christian thing. It's an entirely pagan Roman building form from the imperial era, which is just the buildings that are around everywhere. And so Christians inherit those, and they think of how to have them be churches. It's not something that Christians created in order to have a church. It's something that's what Roman stuff is from the later empire. And so even though we want them to have these kind of Greek-style temples, nobody was ever in a Greek-style temple except for the god themselves. And so that was a form of an older form of worship where the god's house is this sacred precinct, and you come and sacrifice cattle in front of it and that kind of thing. But nobody's actually in there. For an actual building that you're going to have a meeting in, so that the Roman court or any other thing that's going to happen, it's going to have been a basilica already. And so that's like a central Roman form. The other form that we've seen with San Vitale is this form that is, it's a domed form, right? And so it's in this case an octagon that has a dome on the top of it. That also goes all the way back. So domes, Romans are engineering marvels. And so these... the time period of Hadrian, if you know, the guy is a big builder, so you know Hadrian's wall in Britain. So he built a whole wall to keep, it's not the Scots, but to keep the Picts on the other side of the wall, just like in Game of Thrones. So Hadrian builds that wall, but he also builds the Pantheon. So it says on the front of the Pantheon, Marcus Agrippa may fake it, and as it says Marcus Agrippa made me, but that's a joke. Agrippa didn't make the Pantheon, he made the front of it. Anyway, the dome is made by Hadrian, and that's an amazing marvel. So the Romans have these two major forms that Christians are kind of inheriting, and that's the basilica. That's kind of like just what a church looks like. And then the other one is the domed structure, which is like the baptistries we've seen. And so San Vitale is like that. And so the Byzantines end up running with the San Vitale style, so Hagia Sophia and everything like that. That becomes kind of what we think of as Eastern churches, Eastern Orthodox churches, and ultimately mosques from that era anyway. And so there's the Dome of the Rock, for example. But the
But the West, they continue to primarily use basilicas, and then Christians add a transept to them to make it look like a cross. But anyway, that's where. But that's a later idea when they come up with that. It's essentially inheriting that form. So the other thing is that one of the things that they develop over time in the Roman period is they make mosaics. And so that's a Roman art form that goes all the way back to, the center of the empire. It becomes more and more detailed and more lavish. And so that's why this form is continuing to exist. And it continues all the way until the fall of the Eastern Empire. They're still doing mosaics in the medieval West too. So a mosaic is a form, and it's one that survives. They're also doing frescoes, but the thing about frescoes is that at a certain point they fade or get covered over or are gone. Whereas tile, these little stone tile things last forever. And so if you don't, you can ruin them, but if you keep, they last pretty good. So actually all the floors in Ravenna are all still there. It's amazing, the floor work that they
And then these mosaics, this was part of the question. There's all these depiction of clothing, what people were wearing, which is not what usually in our popular imagination we think of Romans wearing.
Right. So Roman style had also evolved. So it's not frozen in fashion from what Caesar and Augustus are wearing. So Caesar and Augustus have that kind of toga that you see in the Roman movies, And so, but over time, by the time you get to the 3rd and 4th century, togas are actually hard to keep up. So it's actually quite a complicated thing. And it's but it's also kind of a simple thing. And so one of the things that happens is as people get richer, they get fancier clothes that are more detailed and harder to sew, and they have access to silk, and they have access to more purple dye, and so there is fashion inflation, and so the Eastern emperors, even the pagans, are going to look way more like you think of the Pope looking than they're going to look like than you think of Caesar looking, because fashion just evolves, And so again, we have these senses of Romanness that's kind of frozen in the year 44 BC, but Rome continued to live as a thriving society all the way up, through the end, 5th century, and the fashion and everything goes on and on, even into the fall. So fashion doesn't stop just because society collapses. So anyway.
What is the origin of the Romanian people?
The question is, what is the origin of the Romanian people? And so Romanians are one of a bazillion people who look back to Rome and use that term. So Romania just means land of the Romans. And so we're very specific when we would say Roman Empire or West Roman Empire or East Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire. We use words like that. But in fact, actually what was often said is Romania. So Romania means lands of the Romans. And so the area around Ravenna in Italy is still called Emilia-Romagna, right? So and Emilia is just the road, the Via Emilia, and so it's called Romagna, which is to say Romania. And the reason why the area around Ravenna is called Romania as opposed to Lombardy, which is where the Lombards settled, is because the Byzantines were still owning it, but they weren't called Byzantines, they were called Romans. So it was still this area late in the Middle Ages that was called Romania. Likewise, what we call Turkey, because of the Turks that lived there, Anatolia or Asia Minor, that land, because it was so owned for so long by the East Roman Empire, was called Romania. And so when we talked about, for example, the Muslim poet Rumi, that means the Roman. His name is the Roman because he's from Turkey. In other words, he's from that Romania, which is what they were called that. And the sultans, the Turkish sultans there were called the Sultans of Rum, which is to say they were the sultans of the Romans, because that's Romania. Well, so Romania. Now let's talk about the country Romania. So that area in the Roman Empire was called Dacia. It was a Roman province that is beyond the Danube frontier. But the Romanian people consider themselves to be descendants from West Roman legionary people, so people who still spoke Latin even though they were kind of on the eastern side. And they have a point because their language is descended from Latin. And so Romanian is a descendant, so culturally it has survived, the Latin language has survived among the Moldavians and the Vlachs. And so those are the Romanian peoples that speak that Latin-derived language. And so it's called Romania because they're considering themselves to be still the Romans. The area that's now called, around Bulgaria was called Rumelia. You know, all of those places are called Rome, Rome, Rome because the name Rome survived so much. The Greeks never called themselves Greeks. In the Middle Ages, they called themselves Romaioi, the Romans. It's the Westerners, it's we Westerners who call them Greeks. The Germans called themselves, we call them Germans. so again, their kingdom was called the Roman Empire, right? So they would call they understood themselves to be Saxons or Alamans or whatever they are, but they are also, their leaders were called the Emperor, the Romans. You have a question? Oh, no, you're just holding the mic. Any other questions? All right, guys. Thank you.